we are going to talk about solutions, of course, notwithstanding that there are, of course, a couple of issues around the table. But we have three wonderful panelists. Fantastic that you can come here. Before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, we are caught between a rock and a hard place. We have the wonderful rock of international solidarity, the minister, who's had to leave because she's got a very busy schedule, but I know that her heart is with our discussion. And we have to finish at 11:45, unfortunately, because afterwards the Chancellor is coming. But for those of you who may be here for the Chancellor, thank you for being here anyway, because you're going to enjoy this discussion. Now, thank you very much for all our three experts who've come partially a long way to bring their expertise in the true sense to the table. Rihanna Hayes, senior legal advisor and director of the climate analytics in the Caribbean. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'm going to introduce you a bit more in depth when we come to you. Aditi Mukherjee, she's director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Impact Action Platform of CGG. I always have problems pronouncing that, but it'll become clear what you do in a second. And Quentin Parinello, the Frenchman with a beautiful Italian name, Senior Policy Advisor at the EU Tax Observatory. And talking about tax, I think the minister who's just left was one of the signatories to a recent G20 initiative pushing forward that we're going to have a new source of income for climate finance, maybe around the corner in a couple of years. Quentin, you're going to share your ideas with us. Now, let's start with a veteran at many, of course, you can be a veteran if you're very young and young at heart. Rihanna, we were just discussing 14, 13 COPs that you've already attended, and your particular place of origin, Trinidad and Tobago, that you've been representing. You've been in the lead of a number of the pathways leading up to the fund, the one that the Minister has just put forward. You've been representing the Alliance of Small Island States and a group of 77, so a hell of a lot of experience under your belt. Let's look at this loss and damage fund.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Took a hell of a long time to get there. A, what are the expectations? And B, we've heard the minister saying it's not enough. What else do we need, and how do we get there? And all of that in 3 minutes.
All of that in 3 minutes. Thank you so much, Connie. I'll try my best. So what are the expectations? I want to make 3 points, first of all, in relation to that. We need to see this fund behave in a way that is different from previous funds. We don't want to repeat what has happened in the past, which has not been particularly effective, especially from the perspective of small island developing states. For us, this fund needs to take a long-term programmatic approach for addressing loss and damage. It needs to shift away from the project-by-project financing to allow for more long-term, flexible and predictable planning by national authorities that are dealing with this crisis. The second is that the fund must not increase the debt burden of the poorest and most vulnerable affected by climate change. So from where we sit in the Caribbean, we are seeing that those countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are also in the midst of a debt crisis, are also on the verge of falling into a cycle of reconstruction and recovery that limits fiscal space for development priorities, for building resilience. And so the fund must operate in a way that it helps to relieve rather than exacerbate this existing debt burden. And finally, we need to remember that even though we have a fund dealing specifically with loss and damage, effective climate action on the whole requires increased financing, increased international support in order to allow for the fiscal space and affordable capital needed to implement mitigation as well as adaptation priorities, which are so critical for building resilience. So I have a colleague that says, and I think the UNSG has also described it this way, what we're talking about right now now is everything, everywhere, all at once in terms of the financing landscape and what is needed, and we need to see things happening now.
Thank you very much. And of course, we're going to be talking about mobilization, of getting more countries engaged, of getting more financiers engaged, not just with you. But before we actually get to the tax issue, Aditi, let's talk about one silo, one industry that's fundamental to us all, agriculture. Without agriculture, no food. Yet agriculture is both a reason for climate change and also suffering from it. Just to see that I've done my homework, SIGA on the website is described as the world's largest global agricultural innovation network, a global partnership of international organizations engaged in research about food security. So we've sort of given that background. Why is it so crucial that we come to terms with agriculture's role, both on a social scale and of course also on a financial scale? And up to now, all the talks about financing I've heard on the food side in UN negotiations. I've hardly ever heard at COPs that is an issue. How are you going to turn that round?
Okay. Thank you, Connie, and very glad that the topic of agri-food system is being discussed here in terms of finance. If you look at some of the numbers and as you have already said, agri-food system actually contributes to 1/3 of the emissions. But on the other hand, some of the most, and it's also the most weather-exposed sector. So some of the most vulnerable people who are getting affected by climate change are in this sector. They are in the global south, and our organization works with those kind of smallholder producer farmers, pastoralists, fisher folks, etc. Yet the sector gets a very, very small part of the climate finance. So the recent report by the CPI shows that less than 4% of the climate finance actually goes to this sector, when much of the losses and damages, actually 70 to 80% of the losses and damages, if you map them, are actually in the food agriculture sector. Think of droughts, think of floods, cyclones. That's the sector that gets more affected. So there is already a lack of balance. You are having the most loss and damage. You are also responsible for 1/3 of mitigation, but less than 4% of the climate finance comes to this sector. And on top of that, less than 1% of that actually goes to the smallholder farmers. So there is a huge issue. And I would think that the COP so far, and perhaps also rightly so initially, have been entirely about energy, entirely about mitigation, how to reduce greenhouse gas emission, But since COP26, I would say since the Glasgow one, and certainly by the Sharm el-Sheikh and the Dubai one, the focus has shifted somewhat to the food systems. In the last 159 countries signed what is called the UAE Food Agricultural Resilience kind of a compact, where the countries have said that they would up their ambition around the food sector. So it's coming into the one, but the real challenge is this. In most of the sectors, you have had maybe 30, 40 years of research to show what those low emission pathways are. So solar plants are kind of, like tested solution. In the agriculture sector, we still are in a phase where our mitigation solutions can compromise food security. So how do we go into a low emission pathway without compromising food security? And that's where we need more investments also in the research space of it. So I'll stop there.
Very quick question, just to clarify. Do we need more science and a quicker transfer to the ground, or do we need more money?
We need both. We need both.
Okay.
Yes.
Expected answer, but still I wanted to hear it. Which brings me to Quentin. Now, the EU Tax Observatory is an institution not all that well known, but let me say that you're sitting here sort of with a label that I've just found, sort of the new Robin Hood of climate finance, because, ladies and gentlemen, what did Robin Hood do? He took from the rich, he gave to the poor, allegedly. Now, the idea of taxes is exactly that on a national scale. Now, in the past, we know that on a national scale, getting money from the rich and get the transfer done to the poor is not always very successful. I think in most of the countries it doesn't work. How are you envisaging a system whereby it could work on an international scale?
Thank you very much, Connie, and thank you very much for having us here. So we're an independent research lab working with policymakers, and we're working right now with the G20 Brazilian presidency on that project of a global minimum tax on the very rich, part of which could be redistributed globally. But to get us there, we need to take a few steps back and ask us two questions. Why are we talking about tax on climate finance? And why are we talking about taxing the rich? First of all, why do we need taxes? Well, Rowena said it before. We need increased finance, and we need predictable finance. We need structural, permanent sources of funding. Taxes, private sector, in many instances, investment by private sectors won't be profitable. They won't be systematic. They won't be long-term solution. We need taxes. So that's the first point. Then, why are we talking about taxing the rich? Well, first of all, to put it as a Nobel Prize said it recently, Joseph Stiglitz, this is where the money is. We're talking about trillions of dollars.
It's just a question of getting it.
It's just a question of getting it. We have trillions of dollars of wealth that is concentrated in the hands of a very few. Second, because any discussion on tax needs to start there. We need to address the glaring regressivity of our tax system, where the very rich in our society pay less in proportion in taxes than the rest in society. This is based on official tax data that we released very recently to help the negotiations at the G20 level. Otherwise, what we risk is a similar backlash that we've seen in any domestic countries very recently. Yellow Vest movement in France, farmers' movements recently in Europe, but also in developing countries, in Chile, in Lebanon, in Kazakhstan, where you have tax reforms, even sometimes for climate-related purposes, that face backlash because we're not addressing the regressivity of the tax systems. Now, the good news is that we have all the technical tools now to design such a tax that would work. It wasn't the case in the past. We had taxes on the rich that did not work because they were very vulnerable to tax evasion. They were very vulnerable to the risk of aggressive tax mobility. It's not the case anymore. We have the tools to design a tax that would work. So that's one. Two, there's a big momentum at the G20 level behind this idea. You mentioned the fact that a number of countries endorsed this idea very recently: Brazil, France, South Africa, Spain. We had Minister Schulze who signed an op-ed recently in favor, and we're working on a report that has been commissioned to us on exploring all the technical details, political feasibility of such reform. I don't want to sugarcoat this. These negotiations take time. The redistribution part will be even harder. Some wants to keep everything at home. Some wants to distribute everything on the global funds. This will take time, but we have a precedent with the global minimum tax on corporation. We have the political space now, and most importantly, we have the technical tools to do it.
Thank you very much. So data-driven, quite obviously your initiative gets a lot of positive resonance here with our audience. And maybe you talk to Bill Gates this afternoon about it. But anyway, let's talk to Rana about this aspect of mobilization. And what we all know, and it was repeated yesterday, especially in the face of climate change, we need speed. So it's not that the right initiatives aren't in place, it's just a question, how quickly do we get the right money in the right place in order to both adapt and mitigate? How do we do that? What is your maybe wish, but maybe your vision?
That, I guess, is the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question, Connie. So I think in the global community, we are grappling with this issue right now. This year, in the context of the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC negotiations, we're looking at a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It's the worst acronym ever, NCQG, but this is what the big discussion is this year. We know we have the 100 billion goal from 2009, which maybe has yet to be met, but we're working on a new goal. And there's lots of disagreement about what is inside of this goal. Is it only public finance? What is outside of this goal? What do we do about private finance, innovative sources of finance, such as the tax initiative and others that are being discussed. My vision is that we need to really take a global level systematic approach. It's systems based, because even we have had the experience from a SIDS perspective, from a small island developing state perspective, where the money sometimes is available. There has been money available, but how does it actually get to the places it needs to go? And there are many, many barriers in place. Some of them do exist at the national level and have to do with putting enabling environments in place. But we have had examples of small countries that have been exemplars in terms of their enabling environments. All of their policies are in place, and still the money is not flowing. There are issues at the international level in the way our multilateral development banks function that need to be addressed. There are a number of issues relating to transparency, even relating to what we understand as climate finance, that need to be addressed in order to have the speed and the level of solution that is needed. So that would be my vision. We need a global level, systems-based approach. And right now, the way the conversation is set up, we have a silo of conversations happening in the context of the World Bank. I just came from the spring meetings a few weeks ago in April, and they're having all of these conversations around, no country should have to choose between climate action and development. But guess what? Countries have been doing that for a very long time. This is a fact. Yeah. So it's all separate. We need to joint up.
Do you see, we heard the minister talk about solidarity, international solidarity. Do you have the feeling, and this is just a feeling, of course, that it has increased? Or with, let me say, a withdrawal from the multinational approaches that we've used to have, has it actually decreased?
I would say solidarity in principle has increased, but it has not really made a difference. Because from what we understand, whereas the climate discussion has gone one way and has advanced in many ways on these issues, in some of the same countries, when you get to their Ministry of Finance, the story is different. The approach is different. The approach is conservative. The approach is grounded in what has happened before and not what needs to happen now.
Thank you. Aditi, assuming that there is enough money, which you just said there isn't, but assuming there is enough money, of course the agri-food system is very differentiated between the bigwigs and also the mainstay female-based agriculture that is happening in a lot of rural places. Again, how would we get the money there? And how would we mobilize also the national and international solidarity for those production possibilities?
Oh, that's a great question, Connie. So the part that I would largely emphasize is also the discussions that are going on at the COP on the global goals on adaptation. So adaptation has been very, very underfunded. Only, I think, 10%, 10 to 15% of the total climate finance goes into adaptation. How do we improve that? And one of the issues with that has been, unlike mitigation, which has a very clear metric, how many tons of carbon dioxide have you reduced by not emitting. Traditionally, adaptation does not have such a recognized metrics. How do you measure adaptation? And obviously, what you cannot measure is the one that you don't necessarily fund. So the current initiative on global goals on adaptation, where countries are coming together to say what is it a successful adaptation looks like, is an excellent initiative. And one of the discussions there is going on is adaptation is so context specific that a lot of it has to be locally led adaptation. So even within the loss and damage funds, I think there are demands that the money should directly go to the local stakeholders on the ground who are getting directly affected. How that happens, I think, is something that's open to discussions and negotiations. But we, as as a publicly funded research organization, are completely in support of the view that much of these adaptation money needs to go to the local stakeholders. The other point is that the IPCC mentioned, and I was also an IPCC author in the last cycle, is around climate resilient development. I think it's very important not to differentiate between climate action should not come at the cost of development per se. How you define the development is open to discussion, but countries should not be worse off because they are doing climate action. So just a small point, I have worked in Bhutan for a long time, and one of the very fascinating things they do is whenever any project comes through, they have this Ministry of Gross National Happiness. They actually put their policies through to see that lens whether the project actually or the policy improves that gross national happiness, which I thought was a very nice thing to do.
You're talking about Bhutan, or?
Bhutan.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
but
yeah.
for overall, can we do something similar when a policy comes up for approval? Can we also go through the lens of the climate action? Does it meet the mitigation and the adaptation goal? And for many of the developing countries, it's important that the mitigation goal does not compromise many of their developmental, not even aspirations, something basic as food security. So how do you balance those through climate resilient development would be another approach.
I wish I had the time, but very quickly, just reading this morning, new study out, Europe is going to have a problem with reforestation because only 30% of the trees that we know at the moment would actually be fit for the future. That must apply to food, even more so. So how do you bring about scientifically and then also as a change on the ground, the crops?
Yes, no, that's a great question. Actually, one of our recently published papers shows that effectiveness of all adaptation pretty much in the future in a 2-degree and warmer world goes down drastically. So there again, I come back to the topic of research. We are doing a lot of research on, say, drought-resilient crops or flood-resilient crops, but we do not know if they remain resilient in a very warm world. So I think we need to do more of that work there. And a lot of the local land races that have not been used, because right now our food system is dominated by a handful of crops, but there are a lot of local varieties that have been adapted to climate for a long time, and that also answers to the question of diversification of dyes. So we should be investing more in those kind of land races.
And if you and the G20 Brazilian presidency are successful, we're going to have one more source to fill the coffers to help with adaptation and mitigation everywhere. You were talking about IT-driven, data-driven methods. That's one thing. It's one thing to know. You still need to get the money. How?
If you look at the attempts of taxing the rich in a very wide label over the past 15 to 20 years, they have not been very successful. And I think that the first step is to acknowledge why they have not been very successful. And at national level, when we had that discussion, the response was always, well, there's a risk of tax evasion. You know, the very rich are going to hide their money to tax havens. There's a risk of the very rich just moving to another country where there's no tax.
Yeah, but we're talking about exactly the international scale. So who would be instrumental in collecting the money?
I think what we can build on is the success of past international tax agreements. In 2015-16, there was a big international tax agreement on tax cooperation, the automatic exchange of bank information, that basically put an end to bank secrecy for the very rich. We had access to very early results, early impacts of that reform, and what we analyzed with the EU Tax Observatory is that the amount of untaxed offshore assets following the introduction of this reform was divided by 3. Why? Because now banks have to automatically send this information to national authorities about their residents. So now we have an international architecture in place to actually track offshore assets. It's a first basis. That means that tax authorities know when assets is held offshore. They can use it. They can use it against the threat of moving offshore. Now, the international discussion, we also have a precedent, another groundbreaking international tax agreement, the minimum tax on corporation, which is far from perfect, but you have 140 countries that endorse the principle of a minimum tax and that endorse the principle of international tax architecture and how you actually redistribute the money, who actually gets to tax, in which order. These are precedents we need to build on for that minimum tax on the very rich that we're calling now the G20.
Thank you so much. Talking about data-driven, quite obviously a good new idea. Rihanna, talking about data-driven, you were mentioning the fact that even if money isn't in abundance, some of the money that's there doesn't get translated quickly enough to the ground. What hope, and we're talking about sort of course, the digital revolution at the same time, what hope do you put into IT systems that would then facilitate a faster and maybe a predictive help to those in need?
Well, I think what you're talking about here, Connie, relates to the issue of transparency. And how do we actually measure, how do we track where the funds are going, and how do we ensure that it is creating the impact that it's meant to create? And what will be required for that, especially from a small island developing state perspective, is actually more capacity building and more technical capacity. And some of that has started to happen. So there is some hope already in the system. Under the Paris Agreement, we have started or will start this year implementation of the Enhanced Transparency Fund. And there has been a lot of capacity building going into helping smaller countries to be able to report on finance received. And that is going to help to be able to identify where some of these blockages are so that they can be removed, at least at the national level. But of course, that's still only part of the story.
Thank you. Thank you also for being short, because I see we have 5 minutes left. I have promised my panelists, and this is also for everybody here, that we're going to finish in time, which means that Aditi, I would like to start with you, the final round. And could you just, for each and every one of our participants here today and everybody who's online, who's watching online, maybe point out the 2 aspects that you would really everybody to remember next week and sort of bring into their thinking and into their action?
Okay, that's a hard one.
I know.
I would first of all think more of the food systems, because that's what all of us depend on. That's where our linkages are so intimate. So the climate discussions need to center the food aspect much more centrally, and finance is absolutely key to that. And the second one is, I think there are just so less of options in this particular sector of how do we go towards a low mitigation, low emission pathway without compromising food security for the poorest. So I would think also think more about what those approaches, technologies are, and how can we invest more in them. So
thank you very much. Well, that was very quick and to the point. What brings you hope, Quentin, as a final and maybe sort of as an appeal to everybody here, that pathway is in a manner of time going to bring money, real money?
It's too late to be pessimistic. A decade ago, what we're talking here at this table was largely viewed as utopian. But a decade ago, the idea of a global minimum tax on corporation, the idea that Swiss banks would share their data with the world to fight tax evasion was also utopian, and we made it. So we have a political momentum. We have everything we need technically to advance. What we need is to grow that political momentum further, and hopefully in a few years you can invite me back here and we discuss the nitty-gritty details of how we actually put the money in the right hands. And I'd be very happy to do that.
I hail your optimism, and as yet you don't have grey hair yet, which leaves, because your colleagues were just so kind, Rihanna, appeal. We have already come a long way. We haven't got the speed that we need, and as you were mentioning earlier, we need more funds for adaptation. The more the century advances with the more we need for adaptation. Again, the takeaway in a minute and a half?
Solutions have to be systems-based. We cannot be trying to solve for one thing and in so doing creating problems elsewhere. So I very much agree with what my colleagues on the panel have been saying. We need to look at solutions that will have knock-on positive effects elsewhere. So the whole idea of climate resilient development and what the intervention is that needs to be made that can then be scaled. So this question of where the money goes is going to be key in the context of this notion of taxing the rich and how it gets distributed. So it's not just about, for example, the creation of a loss and damage fund. That does not solve the problem. It doesn't solve the climate crisis. In fact, it's more of a Band-Aid, right? And a very inadequate one at that. It's more about how do we get the financing where it needs to go and which systems have to change as a result. And everybody needs to be on board. So I agree very much with what Kenton said. We do have some global momentum now, and it's a question of how do we ramp that up, because the technical solutions are there, but there are still some very key blockages that are standing in the way.
Thank you very much, and I wish for all of you that you keep up your own momentum and your energy. Thank you very much for having shared the diverse aspects. All I can say is, well, having been a veteran of many conferences, of course, we've had the shifting the trillions of the World Bank. We know that other sectors have to be involved. Private money needs to be involved. Private individuals have to be involved. We need business, and we've had yesterday a lot of positive noises from business, which on the other hand also retreats right at the moment. So I think wherever you are, and I'm just looking around, we all have to keep up your optimism and all the energy to keep going, to keep chipping away, but a bit faster than we have up to now. So thank you very much, everybody. I don't think I've ever finished that well in time. With 13 seconds to go, I can wish you a great day here today, final day of the Global Solutions Summit, and I know the next thing is a chancellor. Well, who can beat that? Thank you very much.